Who are you? The answer to that question is your identity. And in this particular episode of the Change Your Minds podcast, I want to talk about your identity and how your identity can be the very thing that can either stop you from transforming your life or it can be the very reason why you do. In this episode, I'm going to walk you through what we mean by identity. I'm going to talk about the 3 different types of identity and how they shape the behaviors we engage in short-term and long-term. But most important of all, I'm going to walk you through the most important questions that you need to ask yourself if you want to be able to leverage the power of identity to transform the quality of your life. This is going to dive into the beliefs you have about yourself. Hold on to your chairs. This is going to be a doozy. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Change Your Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we're going to be talking about the power of your identity. Now, your identity really is the collection of stories that you tell yourself about who you are. It's your beliefs about who you are. And so often, whenever we talk about identity, we tend to sit in 2 camps. Some people believe that identity is a useful concept. Other people believe that we should not think about the notion of identity as a thing because it limits us. So you have an identity and therefore the beliefs that you have can be the very things that limit you. My argument would be that whether we like it or not, we do have an identity in the sense that even if we don't call it an identity, we all have certain beliefs about ourselves. And so in order for us to be as effective as we can possibly be, what we need to do is understand what that identity is. In other words, understand and reflect on what are the beliefs that we have about ourselves. What are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves? And how can we start to alter those stories so we can start to cultivate the kind of results that we want more of in life? So we can start to make the kind of changes that we want to make moving forward in life. And so we're going to start by looking at identity and beliefs and how they all factor in together. And then I'm going to start to dive into the 3 types of identities that we need to start to understand so that we can figure out how to leverage those 3 identities to be able to make long-term changes in our life. So I really am looking forward to this episode, and I think you're going to enjoy it too. So to start out with, when we talk about an identity, we're really talking about a collection of beliefs that we have about ourselves. And a belief is an idea we feel certain about. And that word feel is the most important word in that sentence, because it's not just that we have these logical thoughts about who we are, it's also we feel like a certain type of person. And so our beliefs, because they make up our identity as well as other things, our beliefs tend to be something that we need to start to reflect on. Because so often, just because we believe it doesn't necessarily make it so. And so often the beliefs that we have can lead us down the wrong directions. And so when we look at the identities that we formulate or create, we start creating an identity when we're very, very young. We start to observe the world and start to get a sense of self quite early on. And as we get a sense of self, the next question then is, well, so what are we or who are we? And how are we different to everyone else? And what makes me unique? And what makes me special? And what makes me normal like everybody else? And we kind of are working through that, trying to figure ourselves out in that way. And therefore our brain is coming up with hypotheses and trying to figure out exactly where we fit in the world. Our brain, remember, is a prediction machine, and it's searching for information to use to make better predictions. And one of the things that it can use is to figure out if your brain learns to understand who you are, it can know what you're capable of. It can know what do you normally do in this situation. It can know what's possible for you. It can also help you to be more self-aware of yourself so that you can use that self-awareness to be able to formulate better relationships with other people too. So our brains are naturally trying to increase and improve their predictions. They do so by developing learnings, sometimes in the form of knowledge, sometimes in the form of beliefs. And those beliefs and hopefully knowledge serves to help us to become more effective in the everyday engagements that we find ourselves in. The problem is that more often than not, the beliefs that we formulate about ourselves are always formulated whenever we are feeling particularly strong emotions. For instance, if you ever have an experience where you get rejected quite badly, then you might develop or cultivate a belief about yourself as being not worthy or not good enough or not deserving of love. And the problem is because you've learned that when you are feeling rejected, you experience what we call affective realism, which is when your brain sees the world as you feel. So your emotions are affecting the beliefs that you're formulating. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as you are feeling at that moment in time. And it's not that you think it, it's that you believe it. So you become convinced of this reality whereby you are just not good enough. And so the problem is that we do formulate a bunch of those kind of beliefs where we believe that we're not good enough, or we believe that we'll never amount to anything, or we believe that we'll always be alone. And those beliefs don't come from lots of logical and reason. They don't come from that. They come from the fact that we feel that way. And as a result, our brain starts to focus our attention on all of the evidence that might support that hypothesis once and for all. So this is what we need to start out with. We need to start to recognize that just because you have an identity doesn't make it so. Instead, all it is a collection of stories that you buy into. You've sold yourself a number of stories about who you are. And the reason I bring that up is because I want you to recognize that in order for us to be able to take control over the beliefs that we have about ourselves, we first need to accept that we've sold ourselves these ideas, that they're not necessarily the truth, they're not necessarily wrong, but we can't be sure that they're true. And so because of that, what we need to do is reflect on the fact that we've sold ourselves into believing these stories about who we are. Now, this is sort of the beginning piece. Because oftentimes when we try to be able to make long-term changes, one of the things that we try to do is we try to make long-term changes through motivation. So what happens is that you get super motivated and you go, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this. And you're very motivated. But the problem is motivation wears off. And those New Year's resolutions, a few weeks in, all of a sudden you're like, ah. Then you formulate the idea that says, you know what, I need discipline. So you realize, look, I need to just get to the point where I build these disciplines in my life and then this is the way it works. I'm just going to do it no matter how I feel, which is great. Except the fact that oftentimes discipline requires not only do you have to be able to remember to do those things on a regular basis, it also requires some form of energy as well, because it's the energy of willing yourself to do the things you need to do. And then you say, you know what, I'm not sure that'll be long-term enough, so let me just build habits. And habits, well, again, they'll help you as well, because when you build habits, hopefully you'll make it easier to engage in the new habit and harder to engage in the old one. And you'll hopefully make the habit fun and effortless and automatic and all the great stuff that you learn in the book with, for example, James Clear, Atomic Habits, which is an excellent book. But the reality is that doesn't always work out, because fundamentally, if you don't believe that you're the kind of person that engages in those habits, then you'll just do it temporarily and you'll keep reverting back to who you think you are. And that's the fundamental question that we want to answer today is, how can we start to leverage the power of who we are, the identity, the stories at least we tell ourselves about who we are, to be able to ensure we're able to make long-term changes. And so motivation is really helpful. And I recommend learning how to motivate yourself more effectively. Discipline is really effective. And I recommend learning how to become more disciplined. And certainly habits are more effective. And I certainly recommend learning to be able to cultivate new habits. But long-term change oftentimes will be affected because of your identity. And probably the most important psychological insight that's related to this is the idea of cognitive dissonance. And this is a theory or a notion created by Festinger in the 1950s. And Leon Festinger was a psychologist, and one of the experiments that was done was the researchers brought in some participants and asked them to complete a boring task. And they either gave them $1 for it or they gave them $20 for it. And then what they did was they wanted the people, after doing the boring task for either $1 or $20, they wanted then those people, those participants, to tell the next group that were going to do it that it was actually enjoyable. So they wanted that group to lie about it. Now, remember, some of the participants were paid $1 to lie, others were paid $20 to lie. And what they found was those that were paid only $1 to lie later report that they actually found the task more enjoyable. In other words, when they only got $1 to say to someone, oh my goodness, yeah, counting sheep was really, or watching paint dry, brilliant, so enjoyable. When they only got $1 for lying about that particular experience, they were much more likely later on when they are asked genuinely, and remember, this was after the experiment, genuinely, did you enjoy that experience? They're much more likely to report that they did. And this sort of theory looks at the fact that in many ways we justify the fact that we didn't get paid very much for lying. Therefore, we probably weren't lying. We're probably telling the truth because we didn't have a good enough reason to lie. We were trying to understand our own behavior. And as a result of that, we came back. Because what happens is that cognitive dissonance is this tension that exists between what we do versus what we believe. Sometimes between various different beliefs, but often what we believe and what we do. And as a result of that, this tension means that when our behaviors are out of line with our beliefs, or our beliefs are out of line with our behaviors, this tension makes us want to be able to bring them back together. And so for us to understand cognitive dissonance, we really need to understand that human beings have this desire to be able to make sure that they're living in accordance with the kind of people that they think they are. And there's three different ways in which we can perceive ourselves, or three different identities I wanted to talk to you about today. There's what we call your social identity, what I call your perceived identity, and what I call your desired identity. And so your social identity is the identity that you form as being part of a group. Your perceived identity is the identity you form in terms of observing yourself and observing your behaviors so that you perceive yourself in a certain way. And the desired identity is the identity that you build based upon who you want to be. And all three of these identities are critical in order for us to be able to create long-term lasting change. So let's start by looking at social identity. And first of all, social identity is best informed by a theory in psychology called social identity theory by Tajfel and Turner. And this theory explains how people derive part of their identity from the social groups that they belong to. So in other words, the acceptance and belonging that we get as being part of a group, the fact that groups value certain things, the fact that we are all in the same information ecosystem and inform each other, the fact that confirmation bias exists where we look for evidence to prove our conclusions are true and we dismiss evidence that contradicts them. All of those speak to the fact that we tend to formulate the idea that we are part of a group and this is who we are as a result of that. And this can lead us to be entrenched in our own beliefs because we become part of the group and we do not want to give up any beliefs about that group. We don't want to give up any beliefs that that group has because we want to maintain the membership of that group, which requires that we all believe the same thing. And so the main study that Tajfel did was he brought a group of boys into a laboratory and he randomly divided them into two groups, labeled them based on arbitrary preferences. This could be, for example, that some of them liked one abstract painting over another, so something completely arbitrary. But then he asked the boys to allocate points, which was convertible to money, between members of their own group and the other group. And despite the fact that the actual arbitrary delineation was completely meaningless, the boys consistently gave more points, therefore more money, to the members of their own group, which in this case was people that liked the same painting as them. And this kind of showed how easily people adapt to group identities. Now, if we actually take this and we ask ourselves, so what? Right? What does this mean? What it means is that if you ever want to make a long-term change, one of the most important things you need to do is to ensure that the groups that you surround yourself with are the kind of people that would also engage in that group. It's so much easier for you to be exercising if you hang around with people that exercise. It's so much easier for you to be eating healthy if you hang around people that eat healthy. It's so much easier for you to be a certain type of person if you're hanging around with those kind of people. So one of the things that we need to start to look at is, who do we surround ourselves with? And are they reflective of the kind of behaviors we want? And if they're not, we need to not necessarily dump people, but we need to figure out, what are the kind of behaviors that I want to engage in more? What are the kind of behaviors I want to engage in more? And how can I spend more time around them, either online or offline? Because the more time you spend around the people that engage in those behaviors, the more likely you are to engage in those behaviors yourself. Very, very powerful, very, very important. The next type of identity is perceived identity. And this can be informed best by the theory called self-perception theory by Bem in 1972. And this is really about the theory suggesting that we infer our attitudes, emotions, and other internal states by observing our own behavior, especially when those internal states are ambiguous. So what we do is we look at what we do and we figure out the kind of people we are based upon the actions that we observe ourselves making. So often the information that we look for to be able to figure out who we are is actually, well, what is it that I'm doing? What is the action I'm taking? So a great example of an experiment done was they wanted to explore how people's attitudes could shift without their awareness. And so participants were first asked about a stance on a particular topic, like back in the day, it would have been legalization of marijuana. And they were asked this question to establish their baseline attitudes. Then they were asked to write an essay arguing for the opposite side of that particular issue. And then later on, after a delay, they were asked to recall their initial attitudes. And what they found was, remarkably, most people misremembered their original attitudes. Most people were much more likely to come closer to the attitude that they argued for in the exercise. So they said, for example, I believe in the legalization of marijuana. Then they had to write an essay about why the legalization of marijuana would be a terrible thing. And then later on, much later, they were asked, what are your actual opinions about the legalization of marijuana? And people were much more likely to say, well, I don't necessarily think it's a great idea than they would have been at the beginning. Fascinating. Why? Again, the theory goes that they looked to the fact that they wrote that essay, and as a result of that, they convinced themselves to have that different point of view or perspective. Another example of a study was popularized by Bob Cialdini in his book, Influence, great classic book. But this is the principle of consistency, commitment to consistency. And he found that participants who agreed to display a small sign supporting a cause were much more likely afterwards to agree to display a much bigger sign in their garden. So if they had a sticker on their car, for example, to promote a charity, they were significantly more likely to also allow people to put a board in their yard or in their garden as well, which is once again explained by the idea that says that we want to be consistent with our identities. We want our behaviors to be consistent with our identities as well. So again, why is this useful from a long-term change point of view? Well, very simply, if the behaviors that you want to engage in are different to the kind of person that you see yourself as being, then necessarily you're not going to keep up with that behavior, because fundamentally the cognitive dissonance that you experience will make it so that you will start to behave back like the kind of person that you believe you are. And what that means is that we need to reflect on what is the story we're telling ourselves, so we can start to create a more all-encompassing story, a story that encompasses the new behavior, so that we can become the kind of person that engages in the behaviors that we want to engage in moving forward. Because that's exactly what's going to allow us to be able to engage in those behaviors long term. The third identity is desired identity, and this is informed best by identity-based motivation theory, or IBMT. And this is proposed by Daphne Oyserman, which is the notion that people are motivated to take action when they perceive behaviors are aligned with their desired future self or identity. Importantly, it emphasizes that our identities are context dependent and future dependent. So the notion is that we interpret our identities based upon the situation we're in. A great study that was done here looked at middle school students to explore how their future-oriented identities could motivate academic behavior. So the students were asked to imagine their possible selves in the future, the possible self that they feared becoming, as well as the possible self that they aspired to becoming. And then they linked academics tasks to those behaviors. And they found that students who made these connections were more likely to persist in the challenging academic tasks and improve their grades as a result. So simply linking it to the kind of person you want to become really can help you to be able to engage in those behaviors a lot more effectively, a lot more consistently. They also did a great study about identity-based motivation in health, where they framed health behaviors like exercise and eating healthy in identity-consistent ways, increase motivation and persistence. So in other words, seeing yourself as, if you do this, this is the kind of person you'll be, really made it easy for them to do it. Now, there's a couple of other theories as well that are quite interesting that kind of solidify how powerful this whole desired identity piece is. Higgins in 1987 had what we call the self-discrepancy theory, and this is that individuals experience emotional discomfort when their actual self, which is who they are, differ from their ideal self, who they want to be, or ought self, which is who they think they should be. And therefore, when they reflect on these discrepancies in terms of studies, this discomfort was more likely to lead to certain changes. I don't like this discrepancy, therefore I'm going to do something about it. And there's also Goffman, a book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, written in 1959, that also talked about how individuals consciously and unconsciously perform roles based upon their desired identity in each context. So they present themselves, for example, as more authoritative in work or more collaborative in work, depending, more approachable with friends. So we adapt and we behave in ways that are more consistent with how we want to be seen. And Jonah Berger also in Magic Words, one of his books, he gives the example of how researchers were able to have a 30% increase in children volunteering to help clean the classroom. The difference was when they were given the opportunity to be a helper versus given the opportunity to help. So do you want to help clean the room? Was not nearly as powerful as do you want to become a helper as we clean the room? Becoming a helper was 30% more powerful. And of course, we also have James Clear in his quote in the book, very famous quote, every action you take is a vote for the type of person you want to become, which is a lovely way of saying it. So if you look at this notion of the desired identity, it kind of makes sense. You want to be this person, therefore, oftentimes people will buy products so that if I buy this, it'll make me more like that. I'm going to buy these Nike shoes, it's going to let me become this type of person. And we kind of intuitively know that. But if we want to create long-term lasting change, we have to tie a specific identity that we want to be and tie that to actual behavior that we want to engage in. And when we do that, we're going to find it much easier for us to engage in that behavior. So bringing this all together, I want to give you questions to finish off with. And by answering these questions, you can leverage social identity, perceived identity, and desired identity to create lasting change. I'm telling you, these questions are fire. First question is, who are you? And this means, what is the story you're telling yourself about the kind of person you are? Understanding the kind of person that you are in your own mind is just the story you tell yourself. What does that story look like? Question number 2 then, how can you incorporate the new behavior that you want to engage in with this identity? And that could mean that you need to tell yourself a different story or simply expand that story in some way. But the idea is, by answering those 2 questions, what you want to do is start to see yourself as the kind of person, whatever your identity is, see yourself as the kind of person who engages in that behavior. Exercises more, eats healthy, goes to bed, gets more sleep, whatever it is. See yourself as the kind of person that does that. Question number 3 is, who do you want to be? What's your desired identity? And what actions do you need to take, is question 4, to become that kind of person? Very simply, who do you want to be and what actions will lead you to be that person? Again, using those behaviors that will allow you to become that ideal person. So again, perceived identity, the first question, who are you? And how can you incorporate these behaviors in such a way that it will align with who you are? Second one, who do you want to be? And what are the actions or behaviors you need to engage in to become that kind of person, making sure that those behaviors are the behaviors that you want to create. And then finally, who engages in the kind of behavior you want to engage in? What kind of groups, what kind of people? Who values this behavior and engages in it regularly? So who are the kind of people you could surround yourself with? Not just that engage in it, but also value it, like talk about it. So you're in that kind of ecosystem. And then finally, how can you be around them more regularly? How can you be around those people more regularly, either offline or online? When you answer these 6 questions, you're going to be able to leverage identity to create long-term lasting change. I'm telling you, it's incredibly powerful. So I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it interesting. And I hope more than anything, you're going to immediately apply it to start to create some of the kind of long-term changes that you want to create. For now, take care, be well. Please do engage and let me know what you think of this video in the comments. Please do recommend this channel if you are enjoying this. Let people know. Sign up for my newsletter at owenfitzpatrick.com/newsletter if you're at all interested in that. But for now, take care, be well. May the force be with you. And looking forward to seeing how you continue to improve the quality of your life. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.